Excellent. And I'll just start the slideshow. Great. So I think if someone has a pressing question as we're going through, I'm okay if people want to, interrupt. If somebody wants to put their hand or, get contacted to Nathan that you have something that you'd like to ask on the spot, then I'm fine with that if anybody wants to do that. I'm going to talk about ecofeminism in a kind of historical way, but there's obviously way too much of it for me to be able to give any kind of in-depth account, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit some highlights based on some particular figures and the things that they have written and the things that they have said. And I'm going to use that as a way of ultimately getting to a place where I can just give a brief overview of the kind of developments that I have added on in my own work to what we already know from ecofeminism. So let me just start with that background there. In 1952, Simone de Beauvoir aligned women with nature by arguing that both appear as other to man in the phallic logic of patriarchy. In 1974, Francoise invented the word Ecofeminism to express the double exploitation of nature. She talked about the double exploitation of first nature in an excess of production and of women in an excess of reproduction. She was an author and activist, and this term, Ecofeminism, and her book, Le Féminisme ou la Mort, Feminism or Death, are credited with prompting the third wave of feminism. Her title sounds like a threat, ecofeminism or death, but really it's a warning. Overproduction, she says, will end in dangerous resource depletion and sparsity, and excessive reproduction at the same time will lead to overpopulation. So she was saying that in 1974, and well, here we are. That is exactly the situation that we are in now, approximately 50 years later. So these days we live in a context where there are many voices arguing for change to bring things, about so that we'll live in a world that is more just and more capable of not messing up its space, as it were. So racism, sexism, human rights violations, corruption, mass poverty, starvation, climate change, the rise of fascism. The fundamental concept at the heart of contemporary ecofeminism that I think has been there for ecofeminism from the very beginning is that these harms are causally connected. Foundational for functional response to each of these many harms is their consolidation in the idea that we don't just need change, we need just change. We need to resolve ethical issues as well as practical issues of resource availability. So if justice isn't addressed, there will be no change in the other areas. We will just continue on as we are. So what I'm going to do today then is tell a story of how Eco-Feminism got from 1974 to 2001, and then where it might be in 2024. And I chose 2024 because that is half a century from when Francoise d'Aubonne first coined the phrase or the word ecofeminism. And obviously much is going to be left out of the account. I mean, I've tried to provide a kind of order to the narrative because it can get chaotic because there's just so much material and there's so many different kinds of people who do different kinds of things that have made contributions and continue to do so when it comes to ecofeminism. It's not just an academic thing, right? So I've tried to provide a kind of order to the narrative and to flag some key insights that have been gained over the years. So I'm going to start with the ecofeminist vision in the 1970s that actually created ecofeminism's most difficult challenges. So, there were these, Simone de Beauvoir said what she said about connecting women and nature in 1952, starting off in 1949. And then there's kind of a gap. And then when we come into the 70s and there's, the introduction of a lot of stuff was going on in 1974. So we come to that. We find that at this point, the way that ecofeminism emerged or reemerged, I guess emerged because nothing really started with respect to ecofeminism following Simone de Beauvoir's connection that she made between women and nature. And so ironically then, the movement as it emerged in the 1970s, actually at the same time created its most difficult challenge. challenge. That challenge that if women's connection to nature is women's reproductive capacity, how is it then that ecofeminism isn't just an essentialist reinscription of biologism that totalizes women as mothers whose nature confines them to the domestic realm? How is ecofeminism, because of its appeal to the ways that women and their bodies are connected up differently to nature than men are, how is it that we're not reproducing the very sexisms that we might want to overcome as feminists? So there's this tension between feminism and ecofeminism. And in fact, even Simone de Beauvoir herself later criticized her merging of women in nature because of appeal to, quote, traditional feminine values such as woman and her rapport with nature, she said, is a renewed attempt to pin women down to their traditional role. So I'm going to respond to that problem by drawing on the, in a few minutes, by drawing on the idea of healing, and also by looking to Indigenous women's contributions to ecofeminism and traditional knowledge in order not to resolve this challenge, but to put it aside as, frankly, what I see as a pointless academic distraction. The idea that ecofeminism puts us into essentialist, totalizing move in terms of thinking about women actually does a great disservice to ecofeminism, because it has so many other things to do that are beyond that. And also, frankly, you know, I'm old. I was in grad school in the 1980s and 90s, and you could not say anything about Simone de Beauvoir with immediately getting slapped with, "Oh, you're an essentialist, you're being an essentialist, a gender essentialist." It was almost impossible to talk about gender at all without being accused of being an essentialist. So partly I'm reacting to that, to say, you know what, I don't really care. I actually think there's something much deeper to be said here, and that it's not required that we understand ecofeminism to be that. So I'm going to respond in that way. And after I've done that, then I'm going to jump immediately to what for me is a pretty important issue, and probably for many of us, is feminist critiques of bias in science. And at the same time, ecofeminist critiques of gender exclusion in environmental philosophy, countered by Ariel Sala on hegemony and Karen Warren on logics of domination. After I've talked about that to some extent, I'm going to discuss Vandana Shiva on women's agriculture. Agriculture is something that I work on in Africa, and given the way that the global South is now with respect to food security issues, which I'll talk a little bit about later, I think it warrants taking the question of agriculture as focal. And also, you know, we go to the store and we buy stuff and we bring it home and we eat it. So we're not actually as fully aware of our reliance on agriculture as we are in order to be able to meet our, you know, food security needs. So I think the reminder that in the end, it all boils down to agriculture when it comes to how we eat and what we eat and when we eat and how we have access to food, that's something we need to be more aware of, because as climate change in particular affects those food growing systems, we're going to see more and more harm. And already in Africa itself, in just that one continent, 1 in 4 people is suffering extreme hunger throughout the year in Africa at this point. And the truth is that because of climate change, we're going to, you know, the human species is being eaten out from the bottom up, economically speaking. And if we don't have any other reason to, you know, protect the global South from massive harm to its agricultural resources, then eventually we will be the bottom rung that will be the next one to be eaten out as climate change makes living for human beings harder and harder and harder. So once I've discussed that, then finally, I'm going to ask what has been learned through this more than half a century of ecofeminism. And I don't mean, you know, what I'm saying or what's been learned here today or whatever. I mean, what ecofeminist insights have built a connective and coherent understanding of the root causes of eco-destruction and the possibility gender difference affords towards healing. So if ecofeminism start with the idea of the healing of women from their sufferings, their troubles because of patriarchy, or the phallic order, as the French like to call it, that in fact, paying attention to women's practices, women's work, and the ways that women do their work actually can provide a healing in a bigger way, that is a healing for the planet and a healing for ecosystems and species. And of course, for, you know, in that I include the human species. So the first section then that I'm going to address now Nature culture, mothering. So the nature culture distinction is often called nature nurture, but I find that deceptive because culture can easily be not nurturing, but in fact damaging, or nurturing of some at the expense of the other. And that's what we're seeing very much in the US now, right? That some are very much benefiting from the situation over the last 4 years, and others are being significantly harmed by it. So when I say contemporary culture is not nurturing, by contemporary culture, I mean not specific cultural groups, but the culture of the global north that is constructed and structured by economics and by persistent social inequalities based on gender, based on skin color, based on belief, based on abilities, based on age, based on a ton of different factors that we could all identify in terms of the isms of domination. So, so this culture then, the culture of global northness, may nurture the hegemon, but not others, and not other species, and not other people, not other species, and not ecosystems in the planet itself. So in 1974, Sherry Ortner, who is looking at you now from the screen, so the same year that Dobon was creating the word ecofeminism, Sherry Ortner asked the question, is woman to nature as man is to culture? So is this this relationship between women and nature parallel to the relationship between men and culture, like culture is the man's world and nature is somehow the woman's world? She answers that though woman is not closer to nature than man, she is actually culturally constructed to appear so. Thus, genuine change concerning women's secondary societal status can only come about through simultaneous change, she argues, to social institutions and cultural assumptions. Ariel Sala, who is an Australian, in fact, based on her concept of what she calls embodied materialism, because she and I we share being neo-Marxists. And so she just talks about Marxist materialism as an embodied materialism. So in other words, women's work is, connected to women's bodies and understanding of a body as being a woman's body. So embodied materialism accepts neither that woman is closer to nature than man, nor that gender is purely cultural phenomenon. So it doesn't fall into, if you want to say nature nurture or nature culture, that you can't separate those two things that clearly. And I've always believed that to be the case. I've always found that nature nurture debate or the nature culture debate to be awkward. And maybe it's one of those situations where your, standpoint theory comes to bear, because it's your standpoint that makes you understand whether or not nature and culture can be separated. Because of course, if it wasn't for nature, culture would be nothing, right? I mean, people think that technology or culture is a way of overcoming nature, but face it, you don't overcome nature. If you did, we wouldn't all be in COVID. From my perspective, I wouldn't be aging, right? I mean, there's so many things. I can't tell you how many environmental philosophy conferences I've gone to, and people talk about getting back to nature, and I'm kind of like, I saw you eat breakfast, right? Like, you may be hungry, you may want to go to the bathroom, you may be sleepy. You didn't leave nature behind just because you put these walls. A built environment is not the end of nature. A built environment is an accommodating ecosystem, for example, eagles to, start to put their nests on high rises in cities, right? It's just another natural thing, even though human beings have intervened in it then. So if we give up the idea that there is this separability between nature and culture, then we can get a different perspective on how to understand the relationship between women and nature, but also between human species and our practices and nature, and break down the idea that we can conquer and control nature. So thus the eco-feminist recognition of women's closer or at least different relationship to nature does entail that all, it does entail that all, sorry, there should be a not in there, does not entail that all women have or want to have cis sex, menstruation, pregnancy, or babies. And especially it doesn't mean that we want or are especially good at domestic labor. It's funny how the fact that you have a baby means that you're really good at packing the dishwasher, right? How did all these other tasks get connected with the fact that we're capable of producing life? So the fact that ecofeminism is not necessarily gender essentialist, however, so to go back to that point, this assumption that we may want to have, these things that involve having babies and in fact are good at domestic labor, so that's why we should do it. These kinds of assumptions, all they do is denigrate women's individuality, women's preferences, and our capacity for self-definition. So the fact that ecofeminism isn't necessarily gender essentialist does not, however, mean that ecofeminists do not celebrate the female capacity to create life. Birthing, in fact, has historically been, and in some countries still is, primarily women's business. When I'm in the village in Ghana, and you quite hear regularly at night, we'll hear some kind of yelling, and you're like, oh, the baby's coming, she's having her baby. And something like 9% of women in that area actually get any kind of medical support when they are giving birth. And by medical support, I mean even midwife. They do it in their hut at home, and their sisters, their cousins, the people who, the women who live around them who aren't trained, in any kind of medicine or even as midwives or even as doulas, they are there to help them through the process. And hence there's a fairly high infant and maternal mortality rate. But just in case you don't already know this, in the global north, the highest incidence of both maternal mortality and infant mortality during childbirth is in what country? The United States. That's just in the global north, but still that's a pretty horrifying piece of data. So after World War II, though, developments in medical technology driven, a Heideggerian ecofeminist, I don't know where we would find one of those, might argue, driven by patriarchal need to control female bodies, had largely appropriated the process. And my father, God love him, he was a doctor. He was a cancer doctor, so he didn't have much to do with delivering babies. But one day he was talking about it, and he said, the job of the doctor is to, the relationship is between the doctor and the baby, and the doctor's job is to get the woman out of the way, right? So that it's this direct relationship between the doctor and the baby, in terms of the baby's born, removed from the mother. And of course I was like, come on, Dad, you can't really say that. And we used to debate a lot, and so we debated that and never really came to a resolution because we both were pretty clear about what, the doctor and the daughter, we have very different perspectives, right? So early ecofeminism then celebrated taking this power back, the power of birth, the power of, managing that situation. And I don't want to say controlling there, because a lot of having a baby isn't controlling. It's really about letting it happen in the way that it wants to happen, and making it happen that way. You can't fight it. You go with the flow, as it were. That certainly was my experience anyway. So early ecofeminism then celebrated taking back this power, this reproductive capacity, and that whole process. And in 1978, in fact, Mary Daly's radical feminist book, Gyne/Ecology, and we all know what gynecology is, right? So she's playing off that. And Susan Griffin's book, Woman in Nature, The Roaring Inside Her, both those books were published in 1978. And each argued that philosophy and religion have bolstered patriarchal power over both men and women. So they sought to retrieve that. It's not just the retrieval of birthing and mothering, it's the retrieval of spirit, retrieval of spirituality, retrieval of things that had been appropriated by patriarchal systems, by the phallic order. And the journal Heresies, in fact, in that year also published an article, The Great Goddess, that reclaimed religion from patriarchy through the, quote, goddess as symbol of life and death powers and waxing and waning energies in the universe and in themselves. So subsequently, Judith Plant writes of healing the wounds. Ecofeminists were developing a spiritual alternative of nourishing love and life in contrast to patriarchal religions, while also critiquing modernity's materialist scientific worldview. As ecofeminism moved forward, amidst a larger battle of accusations of essentialism that I already ranted about in feminism, the issue of female capacity to make life faded from discussion, but the desire for healing stayed throughout. In the 1990s, Karen Warren assesses ecofeminism's healing power for women, men, and the planet Rosemary Radford Ruther provides an ecofeminist theology of earth healing and recounts how environmental degradation exacerbates global poverty by increasing women's labor and suffering. And certainly the feminization of agriculture as an increased work labor load, hand in hand with the feminization of poverty, has just exploded as an issue in international development in the last 10 to 15 years. So, you know, the increased proportion of the poor who are women and the increased proportion of women who are agriculturalists growing food to feed their families, those proportions have both expanded a lot recently. So this has been talked about now since the 1990s, but in a really big way. I mean, before that it was talked about, but it became really big when the Millennium Development Goals were put in place that ended in 2015, and subsequently the Sustainable Development Goals. But, you know, sustainable development is in itself oxymoronic, or perhaps just moronic. The idea that you can have growth and controllable consequences together as one doesn't really make any sense. So the Sustainable Development Goals, as long as they remain predicated on approaches that understand that you can have development and sustainability at the same time, when it's been appropriated by capital, such that development there doesn't mean development for human beings, but means development for economics, for economic systems throughout the planet, right? So the promise of healing then remained in ecofeminism, and it became, as ecofeminism moved forward and these issues came up of poverty, of women's labor and suffering, the healing for women and men and the planet itself, the theology of earth healing, as these things came up, the promise of healing became more of a promise of a better future than the Dionysian celebrations and the Eleusinian mysteries of of 1978 and the late 1970s to reclaim the power of creation and life. So we kind of lost a lot of the party factor, but you know, we can retrieve that anytime we want. And in the meantime, we have other business to do than that, right? We don't want to just go out and have a ritual and, you know, drink and dance and speak to whatever gods we believe that we speak to. We want to actually make, you know, one of the big changes for ecofeminism historically is the move to actually want to make change in the world, right? To change women's conditions. So at the same time though, right, so this question of the linking of women and nature, it doesn't have to mean that we are, simply returning to the old ways of women being child producers and the household help, as it were, right? That in fact it doesn't have to be, it can be that way, you can understand it that way, but it doesn't have to be that way. But the truth is, the linking of women and nature does cause harm. For women, Catherine Roach argued that the phrases Mother Nature and Mother Earth, quote, give the meaning and function traditionally assigned to mother and motherhood in patriarchal culture. Given that meaning, these phrases will not achieve the desired aim of making our behavior more environmentally sound. Instead, it simply helps to maintain the mutually supportive exploitative stances we take towards our mothers and our environment. Our mother is a resource who looks after us. As another person puts it, I forget who it was quoted in Karen Warren, in a paper in a book Karen Warren edited. I can't remember who originally said it. She was like, no, don't compare the planet to a mother. We need to treat the planet well, and look at how we treat mothers, right? They are overlooked, they're underpaid. Oh, sorry, not paid, right? And if you don't figure in the economic system, you're largely invisible in our world. Right. So, motherhood isn't necessarily something that we should, in patriarchy, that we should jump on as advantageous for, or even appreciated or valued in terms of, in terms of women. Right. So, so the association then of women and nature actually reciprocally reinforces the denigration of each, because we are superior in some understandings, or, we're the head, people tend to think that we're the top of the food chain, and we're not. We're in the middle. We're with the badgers, we're with the omnivores, right? We're not with those, lions and bears and things that are actually at the top of that chain of, change of eating, right? So, that valuing of the human is an overplay of what our roles are. But in that denigration of nature in which human being appears to be superior, it's not really human being who comes out as superior in that. It's really, it's really the man, right? Man in the full sense of the word, not men, but man, right? It's man who comes out as superior, which means that it's hard for a woman to tag along on that. So I want to just look briefly at some Native American voices here. And Native American women have done so much to enrich what ecofeminism is. And I wish I should have just written a whole paper on that. But what I want to do is just really come to this point here about what it means to work in knowledge systems that have not been separated as scientific knowledge and religious spirituality. The insight that those two, and I'm kind of a born again pagan, right? So, which is a kind of religion in itself. And I mean, even, not believing in any kind of divinity is a religious commitment, right? It's a belief system. So that separation of science from religion is problematic. It's good to have the, render unto Caesar, render unto God distinction, right? We could use a little more of that in this country, in the US at this point in time. But really, what it means spiritually in your culture and, what it means in your knowledge system, to separate those things out is also deeply problematic. And I'm going to suggest later that it's problematic because it precludes the possibility of ethical thinking being connected to your fundamental knowledge system. And you need for your knowledge system, knowledge is power. And so it empowers you to do many things in the world, to have knowledge. So to have separated that from ethics is deeply problematic. And to reconnect those things is to go back to this understanding that we have never lost, that has never been lost in Indigenous communities throughout the world. And certainly Standing Rock is an example that taught us, about that. So going back to 1979, Starhawk, and in 1990, Paula Gunn Allen, 2005, and these are just Winona LaDuke. And I'm just referring to particular writings with these dates and to sort of the epoch or generation that these women are in throughout. So these women, one of the things that's interesting about them is they're not philosophers or this or that. What they're doing is engaged in all kinds of activities that aren't so easily separated out. These women that I have named write fiction and nonfiction, and it makes little sense to speak of how their work is at an intersection of gender, Indigenous rights, and environment, as if those three things can be clearly separated out. And sometimes, to borrow from Aristotle, you do have to separate them in thought in order to understand different factors of what it means to be Indigenous, what it means to be a woman, and all, different kinds of things. But really, those things aren't separable in reality, and they belong, fully together. So these women have academic affiliations, but they're also activists. Discourse in North America concerning Indigenous knowledge systems has moved from the language of spirituality to traditional ecological knowledge. And I owe a lot of my insights on that to Jonathan. And I saw that Jonathan Hook is here with us today. And I thank you for, I'm honored that you would attend, and thank you for being here. So, in part, this discussion, certainly by people like me who, are basically born in Scotland and, of Welsh descent, right? For people like me, it's advantageous because using the phrase traditional ecological knowledge avoids having to land on the wrong side of the modernist distinction that identifies science with knowledge and religion with superstition and myth. So this transition has made Indigenous knowledge systems more compatible with academic practices of science. So this transition to Indigenous knowledge systems being understood as traditional ecological knowledge rather than religious belief, or, because that so easily converts to superstition and all kinds of other denigrations, right? So this movement has made Indigenous knowledge systems more compatible with academic practices of science and easier to integrate into equally male-dominated science-driven environmental policy contexts. But it also has cut out gender in many ways in doing that. So LaDuke, who has a strong voice in environmental policy critique and is kind of a personal hero from my perspective because of her capacity to speak out clearly and strongly and not have, she does that Kamala Harris thing where she doesn't let people talk over her. She said, you can tell when she's speaking, I'm speaking now, is what is coming out in the strength of her, in the strength of her voice. She has a strong voice in our environmental policy critique, but at the same time, she's doing all this ecofeminism work. She's worked on stuff that's ecofeminist. She wrote the introduction to Baumgartner and Richard's Field Guide for Feminist Activists, but she doesn't identify as ecofeminist. When she's been asked, she's like, yeah. So one thing we've learned here is you don't have to declare you're an ecofeminist or say you're an ecofeminist to be working toward ecofeminist goals. And I'm going to come back to that at the end of what I have to say. But anyone with gender consciousness and a commitment to environmental protection and defense can contribute to ecofeminist goals. So I don't know about other ecofeminists, but I don't really care what you say you are. It's all about what you're doing. And if you're doing is, if what you're doing is consistent with that program or if it's separated from it. So I'm going to move now to another question, which is the question of science, philosophy, bias. And I'm going to talk about Ariel Sala and Karen Warren on hegemony and domination. So in 1980, I'm going to start with Carolyn Merchant. Carolyn recognized the connection between patriarchy and science. She identified misogyny going back to Bacon's writings in the early 17th century about experiment that he said extracts nature's secrets. And you can see the quote that I put the quote up. Out of her, and I put the word her and just to, get the phrasing right for, as I extracted the sentence. So he refers to nature as a she. And actually in his work on this, in his writing on this in 1620, he actually is taking from courtroom witch trial language. So experiment extracts nature's secrets out of her very bowels when she is under constraint and vexed. That is to say, when by art in the hand of man, she is forced out of her natural state and squeezed and molded. So basically he makes nature a woman and then he says we torture it to get information out of it. So I don't know, to me that's misogyny. Merchant argues further that Descartes' mechanistic vision of reality reduces women to their body available for exploitation, whether it's for labor, sex, reproduction, like any natural resource. Strong critique followed Carolyn Merchant's perspective in the 1980s. I'm thinking of Sandra Harding and Nancy Tuana here. Their research showed the devaluing of women's contribution and the rampant androcentrism of the sciences, in particular the epistemological demand for objectivity that I've argued in tons of places, precludes, most recently in a paper on Donna Eide, precludes the possibility of ethical thinking, which is something that I attribute Eide as describing, and that in his critiques of science, this is one of the points that he's making. And I just kind of pull it out of him a bit and make it a little more explicit, that objectivity requires not caring. It requires not being partial to, right? And that means that it precludes the possibility of ethical thinking, because ethical thinking needs the recognition of the other, the care to want to listen to what the person has to say, find out what the person's perspective is. So you need to be ethical, you need to have emotional connection. You need to have feelings. And science, the epistemology and also ontology of sciences, we know it these days precludes doing that because it demands that you have the distance of objectivity. In the 1980s, Ariel Sala argued similarly that against deep ecologists for the place of ecofeminism in environmental philosophy. The ecofeminism deep ecology debate isn't actually such a big debate over philosophical theory, more than it is as a debate over sexism, over the fact that women don't get, weren't getting onto the, somebody's in the waiting room. Sorry, I just got an announcement. Somebody's in the waiting room. That, sorry, I shouldn't have said that in the middle of a sentence because now I forget what the rest of the sentence was. And then sexism. So women would submit, ecofeminist, because if you're a woman who works on environmental issues, naturally you're an ecofeminist. I find just being a woman in the academy made me a feminist. I'd go and take a job. I never studied it. I never trained in it. I wasn't interested in it. And eventually I just had to learn feminism so that I didn't completely do a mess of it, because many places that I went to, they were like, oh yeah, you have a vagina, you can teach feminism. I'm like, okay, great. Hey, who'd have thought? That's a skill that comes along with having a vagina. Woohoo, right? So, So there you go. So Sala launched the view from an eco-feminist standpoint that deep ecology is a self-congratulatory reformist move that, quote, fails to face up to the uncomfortable psychosexual origins of our culture and its crisis in its need for control. And basically, if those are the fundamental problems that are driving a lot of the things that need to be changed on the planet, that the deep ecologists really wanted to change, I said wanted because I'm not sure there's too many deep ecologists around these days. Maybe there are, and I just don't know them, right? But the things that they wanted as their goals for changing human behavior and changing how we are and the damage that we're doing to the planet, if they then don't recognize to the gender issue, how are they going to be able to achieve those goals? Because the gender issue, as we learn in how they respond to women submitting papers to, conferences and to journals, not to have women put on the agenda, put on the, have their papers accepted either for the journal or for the paper. If they can't accommodate the question of gender, they cannot achieve what they want, because gender issues are at the fundamental heart of it. The appropriation of women's bodies and women's labor, etc. In 1987, Janet Beale argued that deep ecologists implicate women in the male project of domination over nature. So women are excluded from the environmental philosophy, but at the same time attributed with the harms that deep ecology wants to. So the argument is that the destruction of the planet is, because it's under patriarchal capital, is actually a male project of domination over nature, and that women's, as we see with Vandana Shiva, women's approach to managing nature, to growing agriculture, for example, you don't conquer the field. You have to be able to see what's going on and work with it. You have to understand that you are part of a process, and your role is there just to manage it. You're actually part of a water process, right? It rains, it goes up, it, the moisture cools down and gets pushed out, as it comes up out of the ocean and gets pushed out over the land. And when it gets too cool, it drops in rain, and then the rain ends up going into rivers, which go out. So you have this circular system. And Vandana Shiva says women's role in that is to simply keep the circle moving around. Right? It's not her role to, so basically women's agriculture is the circular process of respecting nature's cycles, whereas industrial agriculture isn't this circular process. It's a straight line from the field to the bank account, because it's not about feeding people. Industrial agriculture is about making profits, right? So, so Sala said that deep ecologists underestimate both the eco-feminist challenge to epistemology and how much work is necessary to bring about social change. In the meantime, interestingly, so she was publishing, so thank you to Jean Hargrove for putting the eco-feminist deep ecology debate in his journal, Environmental Ethics, because by doing that, he actually made the debate and he got their voices heard. So Sala published in there, 3 times, and eventually these male voices chimed in. So Jim Chaney published a paper accusing deep ecology of simply being androcentric, and Michael Zimmerman actually also argued in Environmental Ethics for, quote, the global awakening of the quest for the feminine voice to counterbalance the one-sidedness of the masculine voice. And that idea of balance, that idea that ecofeminism isn't about, get rid of the male perspective or get rid of men or anything like that. It's about, let's establish a kind of a balance, right? That women need to have voices and women need to be participating in policy and women need to be part of the game, because there's so much involved in the labor of it, but also they can do things that counter the extreme masculinism of global capital and how it's damaging the planet at this point. So, as Sala puts it, the political attitudes are meaningful only in deep ecology, she said, to white male middle-class professionals whose thought is not grounded. So sorry, that's kind of like a lot of us, right? That's kind of our category, except also adding the male part, whose thought is not grounded in the labor of daily maintenance and survival, because a lot of that maintenance and survival is actually being done, by others. And that's in some sense true for women too. But then again, it still remains the practice. COVID has been a real impediment to women scholars because they are the ones that already that still largely hold the task of completing the domestic chores that need to be done, including preparing food, cleaning up from food, even but you earn the money now for it and then you go out and buy it, etc. Right? So women are still in that role, and therefore the demand from the children and from the family in the household falls heavier on the woman. So if you're doing stuff at home and you're in lockdown, women's work has increased significantly so that their capacity to write papers and meet academic standards for promotion, etc., has been challenged by the impact of COVID on them in this particularly, gender way. So at the same time that Sala was arguing this, and interestingly, change didn't happen on this until Cheney and Zimmerman came in, and I can't tell you how many times that happened to me. I'll be at a conference or at a dinner or something, and I'll say, hey, what about this? And people will be like, I don't know. And 10 minutes later, everybody knows about this, right? It's a common thing. A man in the room will say, well, hey, here's this thing. And everyone's like, oh, wow, that's such a good idea. Funny someone had already thought of that. And I'm just like, and in the end, you have to just not really care because it's not really about you. It's about the fact that the idea is a good idea. You should get out there, but it is pretty frustrating. It is pretty irritating. I actually taught with a computer scientist one year because he was teaching an ethics class and the students weren't liking it at all. And so he wanted some help with it. And I suggested that we, do a certain kind of a thing, that we have them do, group presentations of particular ethical situations rather than just throw a bunch of theory of, different systems of thinking about ethics at them, right? And he was like, I don't know. And one night he calls me up and I'm like, hey, you're calling me up. And he says, hey, I'm at this party and I met this guy and I just was saying that thing that you were saying. And he started talking about it. And it's actually, we should do that. And I just was like, okay, then. The guy at the party, but you wouldn't listen to me, who you got in to help you because I've been doing it for 20 years, right? When I said we should do it, it wasn't enough. But the guy at the party, now we're going to do it. I mean, it's weird that he was a character, that guy. But, it's weird that what does it take for a woman's voice to actually be recognized as saying something valuable and not as bitch or uninformed or naive or whatever it is that, dismisses her input as not counting. And if it does count, it's a threat, right? I spend a lot of time tiptoeing around my male colleagues. You have no idea what it's like to be a woman in the academy. And if you think about it, philosophy, I mean, we only do it in universities, basically, formally for pay, right? And, women, we just passed, last year was 100 years since women first in the global north were admitted to universities. Right? So it's only been 100 years. So in many ways, the academy is the last bastion of, gender bias when it comes to the question of knowledge. And for 100 years now, women have been trying to overcome that, but we still see that it just reproduces itself every generation, and every generation has to push back against it because otherwise we'll just end up moving backwards, right? So Plumwood argues at the same time that dominant trends in environmental philosophy embed themselves with rationalist philosophical frameworks, which are not only biased from a gender perspective, but inimical to nature as well. So it's not just that these things are harming women or, marginalizing women, it's that they have awkward consequences as well. And so deep ecology in particular, said Plumwood, also an Australian, in particular remains sexist because it fails to acknowledge gender difference and it retains dualisms that support the logics of mastery that seem to be a large part of the problem. And thank you, Heidegger, for pointing this out, right? A large part of the problem of why the human species is so much destroying the planet, because the assumption is that we can and therefore we have the right to, or that we should, right? So the late 1980s and early 1900s then were crucial moments in the development of ecofeminism as it is today. Ecofeminism, in fact, as a word, appeared in the US at a 1987 conference and in print in 1990 in the volume Reweaving the World, the Emergence of Ecofeminism, that came out of that conference itself. So the contributions were from activists, artists, poets, novelists, scholars, scientists, and spiritual teachers who, can capture how ecofeminism became as a social movement and philosophy, a social movement and a philosophy, and initiated a critique of science and technology, and then sought healing in the face of contemporary destructive, life-denying practices. So the diversity of genres and perspectives shows that ecofeminism was in the 1980s much more than an academic practice, an academic enterprise. But then Karen Warren came along. And in many ways, if it wasn't for Karen Warren coming along and actually reinforcing and continuing it as an academic project, I'm not sure that we would have ecofeminism now, or certainly have it in the way that we have it in the academy. In 1991, she edited a special issue of Hypatia on ecological feminism at her instigation, and she later expanded that in 1996 into a book. In the previous year, i.e. 1990, she published The Power and Promise of Ecological Feminism, in which she argued that the power of ecological feminism is its promise to reconceive feminism, which, they haven't always agreed, feminism and ecofeminism, but she thought ecofeminism could, reconceive feminism so that they would be more, connecting to each other. And just, I didn't say at the beginning, there's a picture of Karen Warren before you, and I just want to dedicate this talk to Karen Warren because she was lost to us in August of, it was one of the many 2020 losses. And I know she suffered a lot, before that. So, thanks to her for all the work she did and how she hung on for ecofeminism in times which certainly didn't help her career and her reputation in her department, but in ways that make it possible for us to be ecofeminists today. So in that, she argued that the power of ecological feminism is to promise this reconception of feminism and also to develop an environmental ethic founded on the idea that the domination of women and the domination of nature, in fact, all the isms of domination. So this is a move here where we go from just thinking about, women and environment to actually thinking about all of the isms of domination, that ecofeminism isn't about just the domination of women or the domination of nature. It's this recognition that all the isms of domination have a common cause. And that common cause is what she calls logic of domination. And I would say that that logic of domination right now is in the form of capital patriarchy, or patriarchal capital. They're just like that. It's basically about wanting your son to get your stuff. And those things are completely embedded in ways that that can't be, you can't have capital without patriarchy, and you can't have patriarchy without capital. And when I say capital there, I don't mean exchanging money. I mean the way capital is now, to go back to the neo-Marxist thing, capital when it's the appropriation of labor, and that the profit means. Did Mary have a question? Because I see you put your hand up. Did you want to ask me something, Mary?
I did. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. I want to just get clear on healing, mothering, and reproduction.
Mm-hmm.
So do you see healing as part of keeping the circle moving? Keeping the circle going?
Well, I mean, I think that that's part of being healthy, right? That's a healthy process, like the circle of, you mean the circle of water for agriculture and food security? Or, I mean, there's lots of ways to think about.
As opposed to the straight line to someone's pocketbook sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I would think that, I think healing is a process of getting to understanding those systems and becoming comfortable as a functioner in that system, rather than someone that has to run the system or boss the system. You understand your place and that you have a particular task to do in the system, and you do that task, but that doesn't make you better than the rabbits, or, someone who should pursue the processes of the industrialization of agriculture that doesn't let nature have its way, and rather than letting the field, sit there for a year so that the soil has a chance to refresh itself. Instead you put all kinds of things on the ground that are going to make things grow better, and eventually you exhaust your soil when you do that, right? So understanding that circular process, I think, is actually a healthy thing, whereas the healing is what gets you to be able to be that. Does that make sense? Does that answer that?
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand this in the kind of Marxist feminist critique of reproductive labor, because it seems like another thing that women have to do. Women have to be the healers. Women have to restore the balance of things. I mean, That's the burden.
Yeah, I mean, it is, right? It is. But, I mean, our job's always been clean things up, right? So, I mean, really, that's what ecofeminism in a sense says. I mean, what do you want to do? You want to just leave things as they are? If not, we have to step up and we have to try and bring about changes, right? And it is sort of unfair that now that the planet's been messed up, that it would fall to women to clean it up. But really, one of the fundamental points of ecofeminism that I want to make today is that you don't have to be a woman to be an ecofeminist, right? So it's not just that women need to clean it up. Everybody needs to clean it up. So the task is to get I mean, if you look at capitalism, those who are the most rich, I mean, the number of women that are in the, richest, that run the richest organizations is less than 10%, right? So, I mean, capital is a really successful project led for the most part and benefiting for the most part, extremely rich men. I mean, it's the Koch brothers. I mean, I'm sorry, one of them passed away now, but it was always the Koch brothers. It was never the wives of the Koch brothers. And I don't even know, I mean, I guess their last name's Koch too, right? So, I mean, it has to be men and women. There's not going to be, I mean, that's one of the fundamental changes, right? We don't just need change, we need just change. And just change means men have to be involved in the cleaning up process too, in changing things. And especially when men are in the positions of power that are actually at the root, running oil companies, for example. I mean, Trudeau, as soon as he took power, he gave up on he lasted about a month before the oil sands people convinced him, look, you cannot the Albertans are basically, you will kill us if you get rid of, before oil, Albertans were starving in big ways, right? It was tough living there, terrible winter living conditions, and they just didn't have enough money. And they were living in poverty and squalor. And then oil came along and suddenly Alberta is the richest, province in the country, right? So oil is really important, but that's such a short-term solution, right? So the payoffs that go into the American government to promote and continue the oil industry in the US, that's men paying men, right? And so, sorry, I mean, I don't want to be sexist and racist or whatever, but basically it's a white man problem. And that's just the reality of it. And it's hard to say that in the academy. And, no wonder my male colleagues, I have to tiptoe around them, because then I'll tiptoe around them and then I'll say something like that. But the thing is that they tend to take it personally. I mean, it's always been a problem for feminism. If you start to critique, common patterns of male behavior, everybody's like, oh, you're talking about me. No, I have to be really offended, kind of thing.
Just so I understand the theoretical move that you're making, is the thought that women disown capitalism, don't reproduce the system as it is, but aim to heal the earth, and so that there can be a different kind of reproductive labor in place?
Right. So basically, the women that I work with in Ghana live on less than $1 a month. And there's no poverty category for that. It's so poor. It's the poverty category start at living on less than $2 a day. And I'm talking about women who live on, $1 a month. Can you imagine living on less than $15 in a year? Right? $12 basically in a year. If you wear it, you sewed it. Right. And how did you have to get fabric pieces left off from the seamstress in her, she gives it to you, or you can take it out of the trash, and then you have to get thread somehow. And right, if you're going to eat it, you grew it. Right. So, so there's women throughout the planet, and men as well, but mostly women, because women overwhelmingly, I mean, I remember being at one meeting and giving a paper on women's farming in Africa. And in the question period, this guy put his hand up and he said, why don't you, all these ideas are good, but why don't you focus on a topic that affects more people? And I was like, okay, well, if 70% of the agriculturalists on the planet are women. And, I just did the math and said, so basically I'm talking about 2.5 billion people. Is that enough for you? Right. I mean, there's this invisibility that goes along with women's work, but women live outside of those economies, and they do all through the world. There's a ton of examples. I've written a bunch of stuff about this. There's examples in India in particular from women's agriculture. Right. So we don't all work in this economy that we're, it's assumed that, the internet is everywhere and global capital is everywhere. And well, it's not, right. It's absolutely is not. And there's lots of other economic approaches approaches. And what are those women doing? They are caring for their children, they're feeding them. And they're not, caring in the sense of having, I won't have to give the rest of the paper now because you actually hit on the key question. And it's basically the point, right? Is that their work it's their work. It's not that, we have the care gene as women and that we just happen to love things. And so we feed them. It's actually the work that we do to feed our children, right? I mean, sure, we love our children, I would think, for the most part anyway, and we look after our children, but most of women's work is actually care work for other people, right? It's not work. So, and I'm selfish. I say to my son, you got to make your own, mac and cheese, because I'm writing a paper right now, right? But most of women's work is care work for others. And we are the first healthcare people when it comes to health. It's one of the problems of being a woman in the workforce is, I don't know if we want to hire a woman because she's going to need all these days off to look after her sick kids. This assumption, maybe it's not as strong or maybe it's just not as articulated, but certainly in my career lifetime, and admittedly that's a long time because I'm old, but this assumption that it's the mother who will stay home with the child when the child is sick. And if you look at AIDS in South Africa, for example, when the president of South Africa denied that AIDS was real in South Africa because he thought that it would be an admission that South Africans were immoral, so he denied that it existed. So it just went rampant throughout the, throughout the country. So the women do the healthcare, and throughout the global South, if you can't get to a hospital, it's the women who do the care, right? But then, of course, at some point, the guy recognized. The president was persuaded to understand that, in fact, too many people are dying, especially with the combination of AIDS and TB, and so he needed to do something about it. So he agreed to change his perspective and change his view. And so then funding clinics became a thing. So what happened? Male doctors got paid to work in those clinics. So women's healthcare labor is largely, globally speaking, labor that is unpaid and therefore is unrecognized because it doesn't figure in economic calculations, right? Just like women's agriculture. If you grow subsistence, in other words, grow for your family to eat rather than grow to take it to market, you don't get in the GDP. And so it's like you're not there, you're invisible. And then your land can be appropriated in a country that now, so it happens all throughout Africa, that what happens is a company comes along and says, we want to help your economy. So we're going to build this, we're going to have this plantation and we're going to grow bananas and we're going to sell them. And then you're going to have all this money because you'll be able to ship them to, you're in Africa, right? Be able to ship them all to Europe, or fish, or whatever it is, whatever that food resource is. And so what they do is they take over land, right? And they say, oh, this land is empty. So they take over they buy the land and they start growing it. But of course, a woman used to use that land to feed her family, but she was invisible because she doesn't have a thing saying that she owns it, and she doesn't, she's not in the cash system, so she's not in the economic acknowledgement, system. So now the country starts to look richer because the GDP goes up. But the actual lived experience of poverty has increased because now she has nowhere to grow the food. She has to go and work now for the plantation. So she's in terrible labor conditions now. She's exploited as a sexual object while she's in that work, which is very common for women in all kinds of work, right? And she still doesn't have, so she can't afford to buy the things she's now growing. And she can't necessarily afford to, women starve and their children starve while she is working in those jobs. So, there's so much in your question, but women also are operating on these other kinds of economies, exchange economies of, well, I'll give you some thread if you give me some rice, and those kinds of things, right? And they're economies of care. So in other words, it's not to exploit the labor, and it's not so one of the things that for me is key to understand what capital is, as opposed to just money, is capital is when you do it for the sake of it. Right? Like, Jeff Bezos, how much money does he have? Apparently, if he spent, millions of dollars every second, he still couldn't spend all the money he has in his entire life, right? Like this drive to collect masses and masses of money. But of course, this is the logic of capital, right? Capital tells us that the purpose of human living is the individual accumulation of private wealth, right? That's how we value ourselves. We're like, oh, hey, I'm doing well. I'm like middle class, upper middle class, and I can afford a new car every 2 years or whatever, right? This conspicuous spending is an indicator that you're successful, right? Well, the purpose of human life isn't the individual accumulation of private wealth at all. And a lot of women's work practices or practices acknowledging that. You don't do what you do for the profit. You do what you do for the thriving, whether it's the child, the cow that lives on your farm, the ecosystem, the soil system that you're working in. Because if you don't look after it, you won't be able to grow food there anymore. And then you guys will be hungry and your family will starve, right? So there's this kind of circle that women work in that allows their system to be sustainable and to be continuing. Sustainability has to be understood as a circle. So if it's understood in the economic terms of capital, it's never going to be that circle. It's always going to be a line, because at some point, some profit's going to have to get, put somewhere. So should I, maybe we can discuss this more in the question period. And I mean, it's basically an hour from when I started, and there's still quite a bit. How do you want me to, shall I just sort of zoom through, because we're in Zoom, pardon the expression. Shall I hit some highlights? Shall I skip right? I mean, why don't I just tell you what the basic points are of the sections? Because I think there's enough out there that it would be much better to have a discussion. So maybe I can do that. I mean, maybe I can just move to Vandana Shiva, because I think it's important to hear more here about agriculture, and also to the situation in India, because one of the big moves in India to address food security, and there was this fear. I mean, India has a lot of people in it, right? And it's not very technologized, because Gandhi's model was the loom. Right? The loom was his model for understanding development in his country, that it's something you put your energy into and it produces things. It's mechanical, but it's not plug-inable, right? You don't plug it into a wall, right? It's not driven by power that comes in through your wall. So it was a very different model against the industrialization model that was being played out in awkward ways in other places, and in Africa in particular, right? So his model was quite quite different. And so Shiva will tell us about that. But then there was this prediction that people are going to starve, that there's going to be mass starvation in India because of changing weather conditions, or for whatever reason. So the Green Revolution was introduced, and the Green Revolution was a science program that was largely based on technologies and knowledge transfer from the global north to the global south. So from Europe and North America and other countries in the global north to countries to India. So this transfer of knowledge and technology, and it was very heavily chemicalized. It involved a lot of a lot of the stuff that goes into that actually originates in fossil fuel sources, and the idea was that it was going to rapidly increase the agricultural productivity in India, which would mean that there wouldn't be the starvation that could be staged. And a lot of people say that it worked, that it did, right? Well, I have a little bit more to say about that later, but Vandana Shiva has always been very strongly opposed to it, because she says, look, women's practices actually are sustainable, and what you're doing. So for example, one of the things that she talks about is the movement. So some scientists got a grant and they went to India and they studied the plants there, and they found out that eucalyptus produces a ton of leaf for a smaller amount of water. So it turns out to be the most efficient if you can grow eucalyptus, because for the lowest amount of water in comparison with other plants, you'll get the most amount of leaf production. So be a really efficient way to grow food. So they, got rid of a lot of local farming and went to this monoculture of eucalyptus. But of course, they'd only been, doing these experiments on, growing these eucalyptus plants for a short period of time. And that's what eucalyptus does when it's when it's, smaller. When it's mature, it takes more water than other systems of growth, other plants, and it gives you less leaf in the end, in the proportion against the water. So what happened was it sucked out the water table in the areas where they planted it. 5 years after it was planted, it was sucking out the water table, which meant that there was this massive drought. And so many people died because of that. And the fact was, if they had retained the original practices, women's traditional practices of agriculture actually have sustained populations for generations. If they didn't, the population wouldn't be there now, right? The cultural group wouldn't be there. The village wouldn't be there if the women hadn't been able to grow the food. So Shiva's point is, look, we have these coping systems and you need to just let us do our stuff and not keep coming in. And I actually had a colleague from Ghana who came over to visit me at one point, and she one day she was just stomping about in the kitchen and she was really angry. And I was like, whoa, you're really angry. Why are you really angry? And she was pretty big in policy. She was in the Ghanaian government for quite a while. She was like, oh, we've just been told that we need to do this thing. The World Bank has given us this loan. And in return for this loan, we have to, do structural changes. And we have to do that with our agriculture. And I'm like, okay. And you don't want to do that with it? She's like, no, it's not that I don't want to do it. It's that this was how we used to do it, right? We used to grow food like this, using this system. And they came along and said, oh, you primitive people, you have no clue, you have no idea, you have no understanding. You must do this other thing. You must come into the 20th century. You must do this other thing. And so we basically got forced, because if we didn't do what they told us, the country wouldn't get the grant. And then, if you don't get the World Bank money, then how are you going to do anything? You can't build roads, you can't build hospitals, right? It's all part of a deal. So you agree to the structural changes in your systems of doing things. And now they're saying that that's not a good thing to do and we need to go back to exactly how we used to do it. And I really understood her frustration in doing that. So the Green Revolution had a lot of problems. It produced all kinds of genetically modified things. And it also, now it's Monsanto, right? When that program ended, Monsanto got in there. And what Monsanto does is it goes to the farmer, and often it's the Adivasi, people who own land but are the untouchables, right? They're poor, but they own a piece of land. And so they grow their food on that land. And often it's the man and the woman who are doing it in that instance, right? So Monsanto shows up and says, hey, we can give you this, great stuff that's not going to be susceptible to pests. And, some Roundup kind of thing. And, Roundup ready grains that you can plant, seeds, so that you can grow your crop. And then you can, pay us back at the end. So after you've grown your crop, and you can sell some because it'll grow a lot of, stuff's good, and you'll grow a lot of crop, you'll have increased production. And then you can pay us back then. And of course, what happens is that there's a drought and they can't grow what they need. And then they don't have the money to pay it back. And that's so humiliating. It's such a breach of honor not to be able to pay that money back, that a common response was the suicide of the father. And one year when I was in India, I was there it was the second week of February, and I was at an ashram at a meeting that was happening there. And just in that area, sort of like county, the equivalent of a county, just in that area, by the second week of January, there'd been, 200 and some deaths of farmers committing suicide. So it doesn't just destroy the ecosystem, it destroys the human system, as well. And these horror stories are, rampant throughout India, and certainly rampant throughout Africa as well, because one of the things about capital is that it's mobile, right? You set something up, and if it doesn't work, and sometimes in Africa, what happens is when that land is taken over that I talked about before, it's done by an NGO that comes in to do a project, and ultimately the project's more money than it thought, and it can't complete the project. So now the land is sitting there, an incomplete project, unused, and the woman who previously used to farm in it to feed her family still doesn't have access to it, because now it's owned by this NGO that hasn't been able to figure out how to grow stuff there, which the woman knew to do because she learned from her mother, who learned from her mother, back for generations. So, so one of the things that ecofeminism, let me just go to the, I'm happy to send a copy of the paper so that people can actually take it and, read it. Let me tell you, there's a picture of Vandana Shiva. Let me just point out then, so the Green Revolution was going to fix the problem of hunger in India. She was writing about it in the 1980s, right? 2015, the Food and Agriculture Organization, in conjunction with some other organizations that also are UN organizations or well-respected, long-standing policy organizations, produced this report in 2015 on global hunger. They said, hunger remains an everyday challenge for almost 795 million people on the planet. The part that disgusts me is that 98%, this should be fixed. This gap between the global north and south is just, I've written a paper calling it negligent homicide, negligent genocide. We understand the impacts of climate, and we understand, impacts on food, for example, and starvation rates in Africa, yet we don't change our ways, right? Over 98% of the hungry on the planet, and this standard here is people who, for more than one day, more than one time throughout a year, have nothing to eat. And so for some people, that means two or three times. For other people, it means, every week they're going to have 2 or 3 days where they don't get enough food to eat. 98% of the hungry in the global South, almost a quarter of them are in India. Almost a quarter of those 795 million people who are basically starving, according to the FAO in 2015, are in India. That's how successful that program was in feeding people in India. And Africa, 27%. One continent has 20. So if you put Africa and India, so you got one continent and one more country, you get 52% of global hunger. Hunger is on that one continent and that one country put together. And frankly, to me, that's a crime against humanity. So what have we learned? Well, we've, and in the paper, if you want to, I'll send it to you guys, and then you can pass it around if anyone wants it. So because I've added so what I've done is taken what I think we've learned from, this is basically what I have learned from ecofeminism, and then I say what I have built on top of it to, each generation makes its contribution, so I add to it in that way. The bottom line of what I say is capital. Right? That global capital is a patriarchal system. And if you fix the patriarchal part and the capital part, we could have a completely different world, but you can't just do one. You need to do both of those things and do them at the same time. So the first thing we know then from ecofeminism is that women's relationships to nature is not the same as men's. Secondly, we know that in the end, woman doesn't have to mean mother, right? We don't have to be essentialists. At the same time, though, what's common here, right? It isn't, the commonality isn't that all women have babies, because that's just false. The commonality is that every baby has a mother, right? Every baby is born from a woman's body, and maybe technology is going to change that. I don't know. I think it already did once or twice, right? There was a couple of cases where I think somebody was bred in a petri dish and then who knows what, right? Right? But basically for overwhelmingly 99.999, etc. % of us who were born as people, we are born because someone mothered us, someone gave birth to us, and it didn't have to be the same person who then raised us and fed us and looked after us. And you know what? It didn't have to be the mother. You can be mothered by not your mother. You can be mothered by your father. You can be mothered by someone who's not a blood relative at all, right? This is a process that doesn't just engage women, right? It needs to engage men as well. It's just like those two men came into the ecofeminism deep ecology debate and suddenly things started changing for women. Well, we need that kind of male intervention, but also we need to understand that that's not quite how things should work, right? Right? Men should be part of the process, but we should be able to get the process going in the meantime, right? We also learned that there's bias in science, and that science is based on male conceptions of knowledge, i.e. Cartesian visions of the universal subject. That if you don't have knowledge in that way, the examples that often show up in Hume and in other philosophers, it means that you're a Negro, an Eskimo, an insane person, or a woman. The kind of examples that they point to is if you're not capable of this kind of rational understanding. We also learned that the scientific method requires objectivity, and that ethical thinking requires conversation, care, openness to the other. You need to be able to hear the other person, even when you don't understand them. Then you just need to talk more, get them to explain it, etc. Right? You need to have engaged, caring conversations, not token conversations where you do a survey and then do whatever you want, because if people will complain, you can say, well, we did a survey, right? You need actual engaged discussion. We learned that all the isms of domination are caused by patriarchal logic, that logic of domination is at the core of them. And we've also learned that there's an alternative, which we can call emotional intelligence. And that's what's at work in those women's works. That is what is at work when women are growing food to be able to feed their children. We learned then that environmentalists who exclude gender will not reach their goals. And I have more arguments on that if you, in a different paper. I mean, pretty much everything I'm saying here, if you want to know something about it, you send me an email and then I can send you the paper where I actually make these specific arguments that you can achieve environmentalism goals without including gender. So we learned that we need to listen to women from throughout the world. And that's not just because we need to help them. These women are not just victims. These women are agents of change. We need to learn from them. We need to understand from them what it means to, not be able to move somewhere, to be dependent on your place, your understanding of water. And, the global South exists in North America, right? I mean, it's an economic category. How much do we learn from Standing Rock? That's one example, but it opened up the possibility of learning about other ways of understanding water that are much healthier for the people, for the ecosystems, and for the water itself. And that understanding isn't that instrumental value either. You don't have that understanding just because it's better for you. You have that understanding because it's a respect for the completion of nature's processes and systems as being systems that work well, as long as you don't start poking around with them too much, right? As long as you don't overwhelm them or try and take control over them. So we need to listen to women from throughout the world, but we also need to listen for Indigenous people, men or women, from throughout the world. We also learned about the invisibility of, ecofeminism learned about the invisibility of women's agriculture, despite traditional long-term, the displacement of agriculture that women have been practicing for generations after generations after generations by an industrialized system is crazy and has short-term harms, whereas women were able to continue to protect their context and their growing area, for generations after generations after generations. We learn that ecofeminism, the agenda connects women everywhere. And that's not because we have some kind of biological connection or we all have the same gene that makes us agree on these issues. It's shared, but what's shared is oppression. So women experience different kinds of oppression, but that's the common theme about women in the ways that where they're connected in the ecofeminist agenda is because we share oppression, even though those oppressions are different in different places. For example, you don't want to, if you're talking to women in countries that are plagued by post-colonialism, it just doesn't make any sense in the global South to start talking about women getting equal rights because their husbands are also, damaged by the harms of post-colonial practices. They also have exploited labor and are underpaid, etc. So to talk about the rights of women, the men also need to have those rights recognized and value for them, right? So we need to listen to people from the global South to understand different perspectives and understand how we're connected in ways that allow us to do that for each other. Ecofeminism then learned that what women do is, obviously not always, right? But women's work in general is care work. And to say that women care is an issue of labor. It's not an issue that just puts women back in there. Men get reason, women get emotion, right? That's not what I'm saying when I say women practice care. I'm saying that their work, the work that women do is largely care labor that looks after and meets the needs of others. We know that capital exists, as already discussed with Mary. In alternative economics, it doesn't have to be the way that capital exists now. For example, instead of understanding capital as an economic system, and after all, economics as a subject was only invented in the 1850s, right? It's not that, it's one of the newer disciplines. In fact, if we think of capital as a socio-cultural system, so not as an economic system aimed at the individual accumulation of private wealth, but as a socio-cultural system that structures our cultures, structures our communities, which is what capital does these days, right? It tells you where you live in the town and what kind of house you have. It structures our world, right? To promote thriving. So instead of aiming at private wealth accumulation, it's about promoting thriving. It's about children having enough to eat, trees not getting cut down, squirrel having habitat, etc., as a holistic thing, not just as a one-for that this person should benefit or this, etc. Sorry, my cat is trying to jump up on the fridge and is knocking stuff off. I'm just glad she didn't knock over the whiskey, right? And also then, eco-destruction has capitalist patriarchal logic at its base. So that's the thing that needs to be changed. And I think that ecofeminism can address both the masculinism and the eco-destruction for profit that comes with fascism. And we live in a world right now of increasing fascism. I don't think you can address that fascism and its harms on people and on ecosystems just as an environmentalist, because you can't get the justice component. And I don't think you can do it just as a feminist, because you can't get then, or an eco-feminist, sorry, because then you can't get, you can get at the masculinism, but you can't get at the environmental, what's needed environmentally. The only way that those two things can be addressed together is if you do it from an eco-feminist perspective that works for justice at the same time as it works for, environmental issues, because really they're absolutely entailed together. Right. So I think that eco-feminist thinking, and you don't have to be an eco-feminist, you don't have to say you're an eco-feminist, you just have to understand what the principles are and call them whatever you want in terms of whether eco-feminist or yours or whatever, as long as it's about what you do, it's not about what you say you are, just so you'd think I didn't make it all up. And there's my email. So if you want to email me for some of those papers or for this paper, which I'll send anyway to Nathan, feel free to do so. And I did go terribly over time, and sorry, Mary, I was going to blame it all on you, but also I had a lot to say. Thank you so much for listening.